Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this Imagining America Teaching and Learning Circle conversation with Daniel O'Connell and Scott Peters, authors of In the Struggle, Scholars in the Fight Against Industrial Agribusiness in California, and special guests, Janaki Anaga, Miguel Altieri, and Carmen Cortez. My name is Mina Matlin. I serve as IA's Managing Director and one of the organizers of today's TLC. I'm joining this virtual space from the ancestral lands of the Nisenan, in what is now known as the city of Sacramento. A culturally and ethnically diverse area, the Central Valley region also serves as a home and gathering place for many indigenous peoples. I am deeply grateful to my Nisenan sisters and brothers who have long been stewards of this land. I would also like to acknowledge the Southern Maidu people to the north, the Valley and Plains Miwok peoples to the south, and the Patwin Wintun peoples to the west. We invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat and to acknowledge the indigenous lands on which you're currently occupying. If you don't know, we're dropping in the chat one resource to assist in identifying where you are. For additional resources on the practice of Indigenous land acknowledgement, the link dropped in the chat is one starting point. To learn more about how you can play a role in increasing the visibility of Native peoples and work to dismantle systems that have oppressed and excluded Native folks, we encourage you to reach out to your local tribal communities and centers. Before turning the space over to our very special moderator, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to Imagining America and to cover a few logistics for today's session. For those of you unfamiliar with IA, we're a national consortium of colleges, universities, and cultural institutions based out of the University of California, Davis. We bring together scholars, artists, designers, humanists, and organizers to imagine, study, and enact a more just and liberatory America and world. We work here in the Central Valley region of California and across the United States, with our programming including student fellowships, research initiatives, our annual gathering, organizing institutes and other events, and our multimedia journal Public. IA's Teaching and Learning Circle webinar series is one of our online collective learning platforms. To learn more about IA and our work, please check out our website at imaginingamerica.org or send us an email after this event. And finally, a few logistics before we get started. First, if you haven't already, we invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Please also use the chat to ask questions of our speakers and to participate throughout this event by sharing comments and stories. Our speakers have identified a few questions for you that will be dropping in the chat as the conversation progresses, so we hope to hear from you. We've also carved out some time in the second half of today's conversation for the speakers to respond to any questions you might have. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's TLC, Erica Colarenas, IA Faculty Director and Associate Professor in American Studies at UC Davis. Over to you, Erica.
Thank you, Mina, for the warm welcome, and good afternoon, everybody, or good evening if you're on the East Coast or in the Midwest. We do sometimes get international participants, so perhaps good morning to you all. It is my honor to moderate this conversation. I'm so excited about the book In the Struggle, Scholars and the Fight Against Industrial Agribusiness in California. There are so many reasons why this book by New Village Press is really sparks so many important conversations for the IA network and beyond, not least of which one of the co-authors, Scott Peters, is a former faculty director of Imagining America, and Daniel O'Connell did such a beautiful job, Daniel and Scott, in documenting the struggles against industrial agriculture here in California's Central Valley, and particularly lifting the role of activist scholars and community-based researchers in really elevating the stories. And so it's really quite an honor to be facilitating this conversation with also such brilliant and fierce guests to have this conversation today. have so enjoyed reading this book. I have marked up every chapter. It's a book of stories, including the stories of our dear colleague and faculty emeritus here at UC Davis, where Imagining America is headquartered, Isao Fujimoto. I know many of you here and beyond cherish Isao Fujimoto. He's been a mentor to many. So his gorgeous stories of activism on behalf of farm worker communities and bringing Davis students out into the region and into movements and back are captured in the book, as are the current organizing of one of our panelists, Janaki Onaga, on the current battles around water rights and water access in farm worker colonias here in the Central Valley today. So what an honor to have Janaki with us here today. The book does take us back further in time. I really enjoyed the chapter about Paul Taylor and Dorothea Lange, who through their writing and gorgeous photographs, many of you likely have seen, about the destruction wrought by agriculture in the Depression era here in the Central Valley. Building on the work of Paul Taylor, I actually found the chapter about Walter Goldschmidt and his stories and actual conversations with Daniel that was quite impressive, as almost humorous. And really features, I think, as a grounding story, the Arvin and Danuba study of Goldschmidt's that made the case, not for the first time, but in a really public way, that the consolidation of agricultural land towards monoculture crops that required heavy chemical use and large bodies of low wage, poorly treated agricultural labor is bad for communities, is bad for farm workers, and is bad for the very soil and the very earth being used. And so all of these stories, all of the stories throughout the book tell the story of the 20th century into the 21st, of the consolidation of agricultural land ownership, of water rights and water use, of monoculture farming and chemicals that is bad for the environment, for workers, for people, and for very food and food access and food justice itself. But it doesn't stop there. The book goes beyond to talk about current organizing today and the role that community-based and academic institutional scholars can play in ushering in a new and a better agricultural future. So today in our conversation, we won't just talk about the stories of the past or about the cases in the book, but we will engage with current organizers and activists in agricultural justice, in food justice, in farm worker justice, and in building healthier ecological futures, really. So it's just my honor to welcome our guests today and to facilitate this conversation with you about the launch of this beautiful book. Okay, so you can turn your screens on now, speakers, as I introduce you. I'll first introduce the authors of the book. Daniel O'Connell is the executive director of the Central Valley Partnership, a regional nonprofit organization and progressive network of labor unions, environmental organizations, and community groups spanning the San Joaquin Valley. Daniel is trained as a multidisciplinary ethnographer and is continuing to work as a politically engaged scholar, and he is a co-author of In the Struggle. Scott Peters, welcome Scott, is a professor in the Department of Global Development at Cornell University and a historian of American higher education's purposes and work. He spent the past 20 years as a leader in the civic engagement movement in American higher education, most recently serving as the faculty co-director of Imagining America before myself. He's also the author of Democracy in Higher Education, Traditions and Stories of Civic Engagement. So we're honored to have you here, Scott. So instead of just speaking about the book and with the authors, we thought that we would bring in leading organizers, activists, and thinkers, the activist scholars of today, working around the current struggles against industrial agriculture and towards better agricultural futures. So it's my honor to welcome our guests as well. First, I'll introduce Janaki Onaga. Janaki is an environmental attorney and a program manager at the 11th Hour Project's Food and Agricultural Program. She's the prior director of the Community Alliance for Agroecology in the San Joaquin Valley of California, which advances environmental justice for the state's unincorporated farm worker communities. And she's a farmer. She has farmed in diversified orchard crops across the state of California. Welcome, Janaki. We're also honored to have Miguel Altieri here with us to have this conversation today. Miguel is Emeritus Professor of Agroecology at UC Berkeley and a staunch critic of the corporate takeover of the land-grant public mission. He's also a strong promoter of agroecology as a viable path to transform agriculture along the lines of socio-ecological resilience and food sovereignty. And last, but certainly not least, and I'm so looking forward to learning about the organizing of Carmen Cortez. Carmen is a member of the Tierra Milpera Commission of Community Governance, a work committee supporting processes of food sovereignty, land tenure, culture, and community self-governance. Tierras Milperas is a grassroots campesino and campesina organization regenerating milpa and community organization in the Pajaro Valley of California's Central Coast. So as you can all see, we have a lot to talk about today. And I'm really excited to begin this conversation with you all. Before we do, as Mina said, here in our teaching and learning circle, we really like to use the chat as the forum. When we have sessions this large, we can't have participatory breakout groups and conversations with you all as participants, but this chat space can get pretty lively. And a lot of amazing resources have been shared. So we really encourage you to use the chat as your forum, and we will share this back as a resource to all participants afterwards. So we do welcome all of you to the space. And again, do ask questions as well. And we'll try to have at least 20 minutes towards the end of our conversation to engage in your questions and dialogue as well. So as we begin, I do want to invite Daniel and Scott to share a bit about the story of this book before we enter into a conversation about the current struggles. Daniel and Scott, would you tell us a bit about perhaps your relationship to one another and how you came upon the journey to write this book and what your hopes are for its publication?
Sure, we can both play off of each other here. It's a delight to be back with my wonderful Imagining America colleagues and affiliated folks. It's a great honor to be in this space with our other panelists as well. I just maybe would say very briefly a few things about what this book is and let Dan pick up the storyline of how the book came to be. So this is a book that is packed with stories. As Erica said a few minutes ago, this is a book of stories. And the book has three central interconnected themes. The first theme is that the book is an analysis and critique of industrial agribusiness. The second theme, it's a tutorial and guidebook on how to resist and fight back. And third, it's an expression, a very deep, passionate expression of democratic values and the importance of community. Those three themes play out over a century of time across a kind of virtual relay race between 8 politically engaged activists, organizers, and scholars. Half of the scholars in the book had appointments with colleges and universities, and the other half were out in the community as community-based scholars and activists and organizers. So the story of how this book came to be, I will let Dan pick up to help us see that.
The book is born of activism. From all my adult life, I've been an activist with Greenpeace, hanging out at Earth First behind UC Santa Cruz, Resource Center for Nonviolence in Santa Cruz, and on and on and on. And I felt very frustrated at the imperialism, the ongoing assault on our environment, the loss of our democracy, and it's even gotten worse. So the book was inspired, and you hear the voices of students of the book call for relevance during the 1960s in particular. It's written from the voice of a student who's trying to find his way, my way in this work. I just can't say enough about how collaborative scholarship is, although it's an isolating discipline as well. So Scott umbrellaed me, mentored me, showed me the land grant and its historic democratic mission to help real farmers and workers. We'll see how far they've drifted, or you will when you read the book. I often say you need to be brave to read the book because it's going to imply that you get engaged in problem solving and getting in the fight with us. I am so greatly relieved that the book and its stories are out there, that they're not going to be lost in time. There are people that are very, very close to me in this book. As Erica mentioned, Isao Fujimoto is in this book. Erica, in her own right, by the way, is in the river, as Trudy Wisterman would say. We now know that so many others of us are in the river of this fight, of this flow towards democracy, equity, and justice. The book is a call to get in the river, to increase the flow, especially at this time of existential threats to humanity, to the planet. I just wanted to finalize and then maybe pass it back to Scott. How inspiring it was to have Janaki arrive in the Valley. Damien Parr, a fellow student of ours, had emailed me ahead of time and said, you know who's coming to you? Janaki. Janaki's coming to you. And Janaki, as you'll see in the book, battled. And she has so much to teach. Scott and I were greatly, so wonderful to be in conversation and continuing now in this journey with her. Carmen was introduced to me through Janaki. Carmen is doing some of the most inspirational organizing work. And I have my eyes on many, many, many organizers, by the way. She's not in my region. She's over in Watsonville. I'm so grateful to join her, to lift her up, to learn from her, and to begin this journey. And finally, Miguel, who in his own right is absolutely could be a chapter in this book, except it's the contemporary chapter. And I look forward greatly to hearing from him. He broadens this into an international context, and yet we know that the fight is going on in California with all of its opportunities and potential as such a progressive state with this very reactionary rural area. Now it's time for California to focus on these rural areas, to undermine and overturn the power structure that's oppressing people here. We can learn much from the Global South and from Miguel. So I just wanted to say thank you, Erica, and Imagining America for having us. It's a homecoming for Scott. And of course, Imagining America is based at UC Davis, which is also an intense focal point of this book.
So maybe I'll just add one last thing that might help move us to the panel here. When many people think of California and they think of agriculture, and many critical journalists and scholars attend to it, what the story they often tell is a story of deep tragedy. It's a story with a descending plot line. It's not a very happy, positive, hopeful story. But as we all know, that's not the only story we can tell about what's happening in California. And I think it's important for people to know that what this book does is it highlights a different storyline, the arc of a different storyline. This is a storyline that's growing in power. This is a storyline full of really passionate, fierce, committed organizers on the front lines of battles across the state of California. And one thing Dan and I want everybody to know is that really this book has 10 co-authors. That Dan and I have joined with each of the 8 scholars that we offer chapters of in the book. They tell their own stories in their own voice. We try as much as possible to step aside and let their storytelling have the power that it does. So what their stories do is they reveal this storyline that's growing and building in power that it's come across well over a century. It didn't start with the scholars in this book. It started earlier than that. And I think to really know what's in the book, we need to open this up to the voices of the folks on the panel and hear some of these stories of what's happening today.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Daniel, so much. So we're gonna now turn to the current moment, and the question is really an open conversation for all of you and an invitation to share with us, based on your organizing, your research, your practice, your wisdom, to share with us what does this current moment look like to you? what are the most meaningful moments and practices and movements in the struggle against industrial agriculture in California and beyond and internationally. I so loved your comment, Scott, about it also being a positive story. The book is very light, and the scholar activists featured are very humorous and playful against such large issues and questions. And so in that spirit, I'm going to open the floor by reading a small quote from Isau's chapter that is an invitation to you all to respond to the question, how would you each describe the most important sites of struggle today, the most important sites of organizing and learning from your own perspectives and work? In response to Isau, so here's a beautiful passage from Isau's chapter. There are three kinds of people. There are those who work with their hands. They're called laborers. Others work with their hands and their head. They are called a craftsman. Another person works with their hands, their heart, and their head. That is called the artist. I want all of you to be artists. I think that applies no matter what you do, and especially if you're in community development. That's how I want you to operate. So I told you a bunch of stories. It's important to put yourself in the context of the stories we come from. And in our preparations for this conversation today, I already know you are all artists in the work you do. So I invite you to share the kind of full story of what's most important in the struggle today. And I'll open the floor.
Well, I wanted to mention that what this book tells is a story that that I lived as I was growing up in Chile. I studied agronomy in Chile, and at that time, the University of California had an agreement with the University of Chile, funded by the Ford Foundation, where they brought more than 300 professors to get PhDs in Davis, and then they went back and they replicated the model of industrial agriculture in Chile. So at that point, when I was a young student, I saw that there was some kind of a mismatch between the reality that we saw in the rural areas and the model that was being imposed on the educational system at the university in Chile. And then when I came here in California, as a young professor in what was called the Division of Biological Control, it turns out that biological control existed in California since the late 1800s, when they brought the Rhodolia cardinalis predator, it's a ladybug, against the citrus mealybug from Australia. And then it controlled the pest, and the state of California put a bunch of money to create two divisions, one in Riverside and one in Berkeley, which actually saved California $2 billion in pesticides without accounting for the health and social impacts, that the benefits that would have. But then what happened was that the university fought, obviously, this tendency, because the university at that time was funded by what is called the pesticide mafia, which actually there was a professor at Berkeley called Robert Van den Bosch who wrote a book called The Pesticide Conspiracy. And then there was a demise of this group, pressured by then later on corporations that were funding biotechnology, transgenic crops, and then they got rid of that group. And in the same in the process, they also challenge and try to silence the voices like my voice in agroecology, but also the voices of Professor Ignacio Chapela when he denounced the impacts of transgenic crops on native corn in Mexico, and also Professor Tyrone Hayes, who has done tremendous amount of work. He's the only Afro-American professor in biology, and he has done tremendous work on the impacts of atrazine on frogs and also on with implications on women's health. So this silencing is happening continuously, and it's interesting that my connection with California comes from my young years in Chile. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miguel. And yes, I think there are other moments in the book where we see where many of the scholar activists featured were also silenced or discouraged or marginalized by their own institutions. Thinking of Isau's double-decker bus story and bringing students out in UC Davis buses and in city buses to support farm workers and bring farm worker children to school. And even that seemed to be a radical act for a faculty member at that time. I'd like to turn to the current moment. I invite Janaki or Carmen, can you tell us a little bit about this current moment in organizing?
I'd be happy to jump in a little bit, and first just mention that I think me and my career are in some ways a product of the opposite of the censorship, and rather an exploration of these apertures and spaces of resistance that have been created by students and protected by students within the university to explore alternatives to industrial agriculture and really building the understanding of the social underpinnings of agroecology and of agriculture itself. And for me, you know, Isao's writings and my classes that I had with what is now the sustainable agriculture degree at UC Davis. Didn't exist at the time, but you know, this sort of the beginnings of it, with Ryan Galt and Damien Parr, his faculty at UC Davis, who brought students into the fold of curriculum design and pushed us into thinking about pedagogy and alternative ways of constructing our realities around the way we even read scholarship. Led me to say, like, okay, after school, it's like a step into activism now, or you know, there's no other choice really. It's like really just approaching from that angle really made it so that yeah, there was no choice but to move to the Valley and put myself in the space of being in as close proximity to these issues as possible. And some of those issues, to return to your question, Erica, are, you know, things that were studied by Goldschmidt in the 40s and today are continue to be these legacy issues that have slightly different framing and terminology around them from how Goldschmidt may have studied them. However, today we actually have entire divisions within the university, entire bureaus within the California EPA, offices within government to address these localized impacts of industrial agriculture that continue to plague low-income communities of color across the Valley. The fact that the Valley, or that California had $50 billion worth of cash receipts from its agricultural empire as of last year, and we still continue to have over 1 million Californians who lack access to clean drinking water. We still have about 200 million you know, pounds of active ingredients of pesticides applied every year on California farm fields. These are issues that continue to localize the hazards of these industrial agricultural practices in communities that, when you look at the map of California, they're in the cracks and crevices of these big, highly productive agricultural counties of California. So, you know, I want to pass it to Carmen to talk about some of the organizing of farm workers, but also just to mention that, you know, in my work as the Director of Community Alliance for Agroecology, and I think this relates in some ways to how Carmen relates to labor as well, is that for people like us, we came into agroecology through the lens of acknowledging these systemic disparities and understanding the importance of building ecology, not studying agroecology necessarily for the scholarship or for as an area of study at all. In fact, agroecology has just emerged as a solution and as a movement strategy to knit together these disparate but connected extreme hazards caused by the industrial agricultural paradigm, as Goldschmidt called them, the social consequences of agribusiness. And agroecology gives us some language around the movement strategy towards the alternative. So that's a bit about,
yeah,
you know, the Valley.
Janaki, before passing to Carmen around current organizing, can you share, because all our participants might not be aware of all these issues that you say now are embedded as problems within many of our public institutions and research and policy wings of public and private agencies. Can you talk a little bit about the impacts today of industrial agriculture in the Valley, these issues that are trying to be solved, just as a lay of the land so we can understand the current context?
Sure, absolutely. I encourage, for folks that are visual people, I'm very much a visual person and maps are always helpful for me, but there's a great tool that folks can look at called CalEnviro Screen. And this is a mapping tool which shows overlapping indicators of social and environmental factors, which, in my mind gets kind of close to the framework that Goldschmidt used to address some of these issues, except today, this is a tool that was created by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment and is data that's collected by the government. So it's not being censored by government. It's in fact being collected and distributed by government. However, the tool took a lot of advocacy to have it created. It was not just by the good graces of Cal EPA that it was created. I'll put the link in the chat, but folks can look on this map of California and see a large, in relief, you see the valley exaggerated in color. I'm forgetting what the color scheme is. I think it's red and green, and the middle, the red section of the state showing you where there's the highest rates of pesticide exposures, the greatest concentration of groundwater contamination, proximity to hazardous waste sites, proximity to diesel particulate matter emissions. And these are matters which, since the writing of, since Goldschmidt's writing, now we of course have several laws which are meant to protect people from these impacts, right? There's Prop 65, there's the Birth Defect Prevention Act, there's the Safe Drinking Water Act. However, it's still critical for the state government to collect this information because times haven't really changed since the Grapes of Wrath. We still have these little communities that are in the cracks and crevices, as I said, of this large, beautiful state of California, but lost in this big gash of environmental hazard that continues to plague these areas. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that agricultural development has not been focused on remediating these efforts first, right? Of course, ecology in many ways has been the antithesis of capitalist agricultural development, and California as a state in the United States is focused on advancing agriculture in the state towards being as productive as possible. And as a result, communities, legacy communities, which over the course of time maybe started out as tent settlements of farm workers, are now more permanent settlements, providing the labor, the backbone of our agricultural industry, and continue to be the ones who step out of their house or trailer or housing, agricultural housing, and see an oil well that's pumping 24/7 with a methane flare flaring off methane gas, pesticide planes flying over and aerially applying, trucking from all the agricultural industry emitting pollution just nearby and turning on their taps to drinking water that's contaminated by pesticide byproduct. So all of these different disparate issues ultimately resulting from a fractured food system can be found in any of these communities, and any one community on this map that I'll refer you to can paint a very clear picture for you.
Thank you, Janaki, and Mina did place that in the chat. And, those of us, in the discussion group here, and those of you engaging us, also know you could then place the social overlay on top of the environmental overlay and map food insecurity and substandard housing and educational outcomes, et cetera, right? On top of the environmental outcomes map to really show what some call the paradox of this poverty amidst agricultural plenty in that map. So you could add on the layers, right? The social indicators of food insecurity as well in one of the largest agricultural regions in the world. So I would love to turn to the organizing and hear what's going on now. I heard briefly, Carmen, about the work that you're doing through Janaki and through our conversation we had recently. And I'm just really excited to learn more about the organizing today.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, everybody, for the invitation to participate today as well. I'm actually here out of many voices that form part of the collective effort that is happening locally in the region and also historically, because I also come to this region very recently in the last 4 years. But I also want to mention this term campesino, because when we say the term campesino or use the word campesina here in the global north, it's often very mistaken and used to literally be translated directly to farm worker. And it's kind of, for us, been really important to distinguish these terms, because in the global south, being a campesino or a campesino implies this recognition of an original livelihood that is connected to living with the land, and that it extends beyond the last 529 years. And surely at least the last 7,000 years, if we think about when maize was integrated into the agroecosystem that maybe we now call milpa. But it's precisely this recognition and these recuperation of connection to this original livelihood that is not based on capital that really permits us to go beyond and imagine possibilities for how we can reshape the way that we connect to food, produce food, and actually build whole communities that are working in a way that's more collective. In this region, as was mentioned previously by other folks, including Janaki and the work that folks are doing in the Central Valley, the legacy of all the organizing happening around the farm worker struggle, we've seen more and more how big agro industries have been able to evolve the way that they either control narratives or actually don't implement certain regulations, out contract to smaller farms in the region, or even also cross borders in the global south, and then dispossess campesinos that then become farm workers here in the global north. In our region, we've seen things like the overtime payment of farm workers not being implemented, or strictly being implemented, and leaving farm workers in this position of now not even being able to have sufficient funds to then pay higher and higher rents in the region. But all of that is an evolving system that, again, has evolved to continue to exploit the labor in the region. And not just exploit the labor, but also control the narrative over possibilities of a different agricultural system where labor can actually not have multiple layers of people extracting capital from them. In this region as well, we have a lot, and maybe, and surely it is the reality for other places, is these multi-sectoral partnerships that are happening across cities, and also these multi-sectoral partnerships involve big agriculture. And so in the Watsamba and the Pajaro region, a lot of these farm worker services tend to be owned generally by these big ag. There are these mega philanthropists that put in tons of money into these areas, as well as deciding and sharing sometimes even employees and staff members. So you can see then how the landscape then over decisions of who gets breaks then ends up being really these big corporations. And it's not actually very different than what we are actually recently seeing with like in the UN Food System Summit, where these big partnerships with chemical companies are emerging and are being reaffirmed by the United Nations as these important social actors. But when we know that they end up being forms to create other markets, to recolonize small scale farmer lands. And so, and bringing it back to this region, that really happens in that form here. City officials are either big ranchers themselves, or are also employees, or at some point were employees of these big agricultural industries. And so when we go back to this idea of, and this concept and this connection of being campesinos and understanding this connection to land, then we have very few spaces where we can continue to organize these different possibilities. And fortunately for us, it's been a lot of that happening actually outside of the fields. It's been in community garden spaces where people are planting their native seeds, are recuperating these traditional forms of self-governance. And it's been through these spaces where then we can push forth a different vision for what agriculture can be, because the solutions that they're offering us currently are things like the biotech industry and these philanthropists, again, like the Gates Foundation and these other Rockefellers that actually supported the Green Revolution at some point, that are now pushing forward these green solutions as the biotech industry currently is doing in the Salinas Valley of the region. And so that's kind of a little bit of the landscape and why we push forth kind of in rerouting who we are as a community and really recuperating this original livelihood as a possibility for agriculture into the future.
I'm gonna move to a bridge to think about agroecology and what you described as happening in these spaces of possibility, but it's you know, it's striking me in this moment that the movement for Black Lives and the uprisings of 2020, hashtag of divest invest, seems appropriate here, right? Like, how do we find those spaces to invest in alternatives when the narrative of the big system is just a tinkering at the edges of reform, right? There are no real changes because those invitations are owned, right? The invitations to change the system are owned by those partnerships between industry, philanthropy, et cetera, that you describe. And so where these spaces of possibility are, where that narrative might be shaped towards an alternative future, becomes so important, right? To believe that there is a sense of possibility, that things can be done differently. In preparing for this conversation today, I myself did a little bit of research on agroecology, which I know not a whole lot about. And I find it really quite inspiring in that the consideration is taken not just for the production of food, but the care for the people who are producing food and the very land that is giving of, you know, of the harvest of food. So I wonder if we'll stay with you for a minute, Carmen, to learn a little bit about what you're doing in the space of agroecology, and then open up to others to help folks understand what this new approach is, which our group in planning have really come to the conclusion is one of the most promising avenues to really explore agriculture and ecological justice hand in hand. So Carmen, would you mind bringing us into the agroecology space and show us what this means in terms of the context of your work? And Erin, this would be your cue also if Carmen is willing to share.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. And also glad to be in this space with multiple people who are doing this work in different ways. We actually form part of this group called Tierras Milperas, and our story actually doesn't quite begin with the word agroecology, although much of it is very connected to those struggles globally. As I mentioned before, we have this long history of being connected to the land. Along with this, we're also daughters, sons, grandsons, granddaughters of the most important agrarian revolution of the 20th century. That in Mexico, that really a lot of campesino and indigenous campesino folk really fought to distribute land from elites and those who inherited stolen wealth, and after, you know, a period of colonialism. Although we've also, you know, as folks here know that Haiti was the first revolution to show the world that Latin America, what labor liberation would look like from bondage. So Tierras Milperas is a grassroots organization. I form part of the Commission on Community Governance. I support more in processes where, and receiving direction from the community council, Consejo Autónomo Milpero, which is a council of older people that are connected to all the gardens and that make decisions collectively through an assembly process. And so there, here in the picture you see is one of these examples of the type of land space that we steward. This is an example of that milpa I was referring to. a polyculture, so you have a lot of squashes and different varieties of maize, and also beans and medicinal plants and traditional flowers. And so it's in these spaces that we were able to push off the nonprofit industrial complex that connects with the big agricultural multi-sector industry in the region. We began to do all of that work, and mostly through the work of farm workers. 95% of the people who are form part of these community gardens that are about 4 acres across the mosaic of Watsonville and Pájaro. That basically, as a community, they had already went through 4 different administrations that ran the community garden. So the first wave was a whole phase of what some folks refer to as the white savior complex situation. These folks that initially kind of created the connections to be able to access some of the land for these community gardens. And then the gardens went through a misunderstanding with some of the 3rd generation Chicanos. Sometimes that misunderstanding is very distinguishable. And then under the direction of actually children of their own field bosses. And in this last iteration of administration over the gardens, they were under a regionally well-known health funding institution that was very authoritarian and actually had very little knowledge of agriculture and was very much pushing for a ban on milpa and pushing for their version of what cleanliness meant. And so fortunately, the people together in these spaces were already organizing under their assembly, the space of shared decision-making that provided folks a space for reaffirming these longstanding historical legacies of struggle for land and also dignity. And together they decided that rather than having this organization be the one controlling this space, that they themselves as an assembly can organize and be the ones to steward these lands. And so land tenure is precarious because the land where these gardens are not the land of the people. So land tenure for the organization is very important, more so than land access, because we know that by the way of how we've been stewarding these small spaces, as a community, we have a chance to do so in a larger area and propel this kind of different form of doing agriculture. And why we start with the assembly and the way that we are organized is because in the process, we're also proposing that land tenure and any form of agriculture needs to have, needs to be collective. It needs to have this element that land cannot be speculated on, that there could be a possibility for the way that we can all take care of these spaces together. And so we've just began this very long walk that we see as a very long walk as a community. This began last year as Tierras Milperas, although many of the people who are farming in Tierras Milperas have been doing so for at least the last 10 years. But even amid the global pandemic and some of the wildfires that all the smoke from the wildfires that we experience in the region, and then of course the height of the strawberry peak season, which also gives very little time for people to actually organize outside in their own time. We've been able to kind of create these collective spaces that are pushing forth this new vision for how we make decisions, how we care for the land, and also proposing into the future, doing this at a much wider scale.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Carmen. it's a really exciting project, and you allude to some of the principles and values of collectivity, of stewardship, of long haul work, of collective ownership. And you kind of ended too with the global scale. And clearly the work is transnational, the work is global. And I wonder, Miguel, if you could jump in here and share with us a bit about how these practices are playing out in the global agroecology movement from your perspective.
Well, I can talk more about what's happening in Latin America. Agroecology emerged back in the 80s, so I'm glad that in the North is being discovered. Maybe 10 years ago, there has been a huge, despite the fact that Glisman and I have been teaching agroecology in the early 80s here in California. And the agroecology movement emerged first in the hands of NGOs that were critical of the Green Revolution, the environmental impacts of the Green Revolution and the displacement of peasants. But then it went into universities, some students became interested, and now it's in the hands of social movements. So La Via Campesina, which is the largest peasant movement in the world, uses agroecology as one of the pillars of their strategy for food sovereignty. And through social movements, which the difference between California and Latin America is that here you don't have farmers. 80% of the farmers in Latin America are peasants, and they produce about 70% of the food. Although they occupy only 20% of the land. So I see that in the South, the conversion, the transformation of agriculture has to come from social movements in the rural areas in alliance with urban areas. But here, with 2% of the population farming, it's not gonna cut it. There has to be more of an urban movement that has to somehow understand that the transformation of agriculture is in the benefits of the urban centers. 80% of the population of California lives in cities, not in the land, and the land is concentrated, as you said. So social movements are fundamental. I remember when an NGO, when a representative of MST from the Landless Peasant movement came here when there was the occupation of the Gill Tract, which is an agricultural land of the university that was occupied by students and by some people, and they said, how many people are involved in this movement? And they said, well, we're about 500. You need 20,000. That's the mobilizations that we do in Latin America and the MST when they take over land. And so I'm glad that you have this Milpera Gardens, but I don't think 4 acres of Milpera Gardens is going to lead to a transformation of agriculture unless it's accompanied with a social movement that is going to take over land, because that's one of the bases for food sovereignty. And then what's happening also is the co-optation of agroecology. At the beginning, the establishment, including University of California, Davis and Berkeley and so on, basically thought that the ones that we were talking about agriculture, I'm talking about 1983, 1982, we were totally considered as marginal. Then agroecology continued growing, and then they said, well, you cannot feed the world. Now they started arguing with us. You cannot feed the world with agroecology. And then now what they were doing is co-opting agroecology. Even FAO, CGIAR, everybody's talking about agroecology, especially people that were actually enemies of agroecology and now the white dose of agroecology. And so we have to be very careful about the co-optation of agroecology with new terms like climate smart agriculture, agroecological intensification, carbon farming. All those are forms of imperialist agriculture that just want to green the system a little bit, but and basically ignore the social and political implications of agroecology. And that's something that we need to be very careful. And that language is happening all over right now in California. There are a lot of people that talk about agroecology, but the agendas are very, very different. And then finally, I would like to say that the result of social movements, rural and urban alliances, have led to very important political changes, because you need to change the policy scenario too. And for example, Brazil has a national law of agroecology, which is not functioning right now with the government, but it's there. Then you have Uruguay, and now Peru, the new government. I just was in a meeting with the Minister of Agriculture of Peru, where they want to promote agroecology as a policy in the government. So I think it's very, very important that the organizing the resistance against agribusiness is important, but how we're going to influence the policy scenario. And that's the only way that can be done is with social movements.
Janaki or Carmen, again, would you like to respond to Miguel's prompt around movements and the sense of possibility in spaces where you see movements building here in California and in the Valley? Janaki also, yeah.
Oh, I was gonna tell Carmen to go ahead. I have something I want to say though, but go ahead.
Yeah, these are definitely part of it. I think here in California for a very long time, many of us have been organizing in different sectors, whether it's the housing justice movement or the anti-gentrification movement in the region. And then we're all learning that all of these things are interconnected because we're still in an economic system that fundaments itself in the extraction. And so these organizing from the base is really the critical way to do it. I think at some point too, we were all discussing how we create these different policies around access to land and really realizing, well, even before we can create these policies, organizing at a larger scale with the people who are going to transform this system is going to be the most important. Recently here, we invited members of the Nationalist Indigenous Council to these assembly meetings to have these cross encounters, these collaborations on how we also confront the same agro model that is being exported around the world and in places like Mexico. And we have been learning of these stories of how the big berry industry here, Driscoll's, who goes to Michoacan, gets rents land from small farmers there, makes them become farm workers, farm laborers, and sometimes, of course, not sometimes, many times, contaminates the soil. And in this case of families who we received, of people who were killed by these additional contractors to these corporations because they were demanding their land back. And so part of this organizing work in this region often and always ties down to social movements. And because we are those communities, we are those same people that are going to make that transformation happen. And these linkages need to continue beyond agroecology as well.
And I would say, I think Miguel's points very well took, and Carmen's response is, in the context of a country that we have and a region in particular that lives fiercely by the kind of capitalist constructs of individuality instead of collectivity, of privatization instead of shared land. So I think sharing from the Latin American to the Central Valley context is partially a stark study in what we're up against, right, Carmen, in terms of all of the values and practices that the dominant systems follow or so counter to that sense of collectivity, collectively owned land. Janaki, you had a response, as did Carmen.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment again on the approach to agroecology here in North America being characterized by the lack of social cohesion in our communities that has been facilitated through a history of white supremacy here in the United States and a history of gentrification and colonization that continues to impact the ability for communities to come together around these collective land ownership structures. And I guess, although, of course, as Miguel says, 4 acres of milpa is not going to change the entire structure, 4 acres of milpa has drastically changed the way that communities across California who are related to this work at Tierras Milperas are able to change the mindset of the ability to step into a radical alternative form of land ownership or land access. And, you know, I don't think it's easy to really comprehend how violent a lot of these rural American spaces are when trying to access land. You know, there were times in the Valley in working with small farm worker communities who lacked access to clean drinking water, and having to go to a large irrigation district meeting. It's all populated by white men, and pull up to the meeting with a line of Ford F-150s and show up as a young woman of color to try to have my voice heard. There was a time when I had to have Dan O'Connell here on the call come with me as a literal bodyguard so that I would not just get run off into an irrigation ditch and never to be seen again. That is the reality of advocacy in these extremely politically divided parts of California that have been characterized by this history of colonialism. And so creating these apertures the way that Tierras Mil Peras is doing in a rural place, you know, that's what breathed life into this many years old concept of agroecology. Is you know, Miguel has talked about having been teaching for such a long time. I mean, here, as I said, I didn't come into an awareness of agroecology through the written scholarship, but rather through, actually, the phrase came about into my life through my through an old colleague, Isabel Arroyo, who passed away from valley fever a couple of years ago. She was a co-director of a small nonprofit called El Quinto Sol de America that's in Tulare County, in a little tiny farm worker town called Lindsay. And it's one of the most pesticide exposed parts of California, and a place that suffers from the worst groundwater quality in California. And it was really with her spark that she sort of started to influence much of the organizing in the area with this phrasing of agroecology, which came out of a recognition that sustainable was not a sufficient word. You know, we'd go to hearings where there would be, you know, around pesticides or groundwater, and a farmer from the valley would come up and say, well, I've been farming here for 50 years, and my daddy's been farming here for another 50 years, and my granddaddy before me, and we call that sustainable. So we were like, well, I can't really use that word anymore. And there isn't really a phrase to encompass the linkage of all of these different social problems that we're dealing with. So yeah, that movement strategy really, I think the hope is that the vernacular lays the groundwork for actually placing that knowledge on the land. And there are other efforts I want to talk about related to what Isabel had really laid the groundwork for in Tulare County, but, you know, I'll make space to talk about that later.
If I could add a little bit about what's going on in the Valley with agroecology, it's not a mistake that Scott and I wanted to have the book end with Janaki voicing it on agroecology, especially since the book can suck the air out of the room and leave people desperate on what they're confronting as far as oppressive structures. Janaki in the book references agroecology as a movement strategy, and it is that in the science. It's an organizing frame as well that's being taken up now, drawing on ancient wisdom. I just wanted to mention a few of the groups, many of them Janaki inspired, that are underway now. Isabel Arroyo is absolutely essential to being the spirit of what is happening here now, and it is on, just like what's happening differently with Carmen forming assemblies in Watsonville and the Salinas Valley and Powder Valley. It's on here in the Southern San Joaquin Valley, and they're very similar geographies. Darlene and Yannick Franco and the Wachumna tribe, along with Quaker Oaks Farm, Cassandra Hashida, basically with the lead agroecology organization now, Fernando Serrano in Porterville with Alianza Ecologista, and Nicole Celaya with FoodLink, which is a food bank that's innovating in very interesting ways. I just wanted to finalize, and before handing it off, with the Central Valley Partnership. Going back to the book, if reclamation law was implemented, it would have resulted in a land reform. And I think we need to begin to voice the need for land reform if we're going to have a democracy here in the United States. Don't think that the United States hasn't instituted it before. They instituted it in Japan after the war, and they supported an unequal ownership of land from that point on, pretty much. And this is a direct assault. If we don't have a sharing economy, a cooperative economy, an economy that's equitable, we'll lose our democracy. And finally, so what do we go and where do we go from here? Community land trusts are an institutional structure that might be useful. And let's draw from Mexico again. What does an ejido look like in a modern version? Let's bring the concept of ejido coming straight out of the Mexican Revolution and apply it on a local level in our areas, especially the spheres of influence of cities, which are already designated to be transitioned, but to sprawl development, or can they be community farms? Can they be food belts? Can they be in intensely equity zones? We have geographies that are contested. We have a very progressive state with a very reactionary few rural areas. Let's attack those rural areas' power structure and transform them, focusing on land and land access, land tenure.
Thank you, Dan. That is so inspiring. And I tried to take notes of all the exciting new projects taking place, inspired by the organizers like Janaki and Carmen and all sorts of folks organizing right now in the Valley. And I think the question of community land trusts, of land reform, is a huge one. And I must mention, referencing Imagining America's partnership with our work in Mississippi, the Mississippi Center for Cultural Development, that is networked nationally to the National Black Food Justice Alliance and other groups, also working on land reform questions in the context of reparations and the legacy of cotton farming in the South and all sorts of farming questions in the Midwest, where land has been taken and small farmers and farmers of color have been dispossessed of their land. So I think not just the Central Valley, but a national, land movement is quite important today and resonant today. So thank you so much for that, Dan. I wanted, before, I know Mina has been collecting questions from the participants, but I'd like to ask one more question to this group and return to Scott and Dan and all of you, which is a central thread throughout the book, and that is the role of research and the role of academic and less higher ed focused institutions such as the California Institute for Rural Studies, that we know is one of the key players in organizing farm worker research today. So if we could spend time on one more question, which is the role of research today, be it through community-based research organizations or academic institutions. What are all your thoughts on the role of research today in the struggle for agricultural justice? Or the challenges?
Well, first of all, it is difficult to talk about public good research in the context of the University of California that has been so penetrated by the corporate agenda. Right now, for example, in Berkeley, if you don't bring money at $100,000 or more per year, you cannot have a graduate student because you have to finance a graduate student. So who's going to come up with that money is basically corporations or industry that are promoting high tech approaches. The people that are working on agroecology, they can do research on basic questions about the agroecosystem, the complexity, the resiliency of the agroecosystem, and so on. But if you want to, come up with a research project about the transformation, the true transformation of agriculture in California, with all the political and social implications that has, you're not going to get any funding. On top of that, I see that there is a huge competition of funding in the among the funders here in the United States, for example, where actually there are big groups that are funding agroecology, but it's only by invitation. So they decide who they're going to fund. They're not going to fund people that are doing really, really radical work connected with the grassroots. I don't think so. So I find it difficult to think about an agenda that is transformative as a researcher in the university. I mean, you can do research that doesn't have much implications, but if it's going to be transformative, the research has to be participatory together with the people, and the agenda has to be brought up by the local people. And that's basically what we do in Latin America. The agenda, we're just facilitators. We're not researchers, facilitators, and the agenda comes from the communities because they also have their traditional knowledge, which is part of a body of knowledge that enriches agroecology. And then you put yourself at the service of the communities and facilitate the process as much as you can. But that kind of research here in California, at least in University of California, Berkeley, you're not going to go anywhere. You're not going to get tenure. You're not going to get funding if you do that. So I'm sorry, I'm not more optimistic about the role of research.
Thank you, Miguel. I appreciate it. And I'm going to, and someone else can jump in if Scott isn't willing, but I turn to Scott as someone who's worked on the study of higher education and both its liberatory and problematic roles in these kinds of movements. Scott, do you have thoughts?
Yes, there's so much to talk about. We're really opening up a whole weekend of conversation that we should have meals together to talk through. And I thank Imagining America for creating this space for us to engage around these questions. It's been great. I will just say that listening to Miguel and everyone else, the project is an organizing project. If we don't have lots of money, we have to think about what the sources of power are that we can develop together, that we can ethically and responsibly exercise together. So there's great and deep and important power in relationships. And so research has to begin with relationships. And research has to begin with people navigating all of the challenges of creating relationships across lines of difference. So the good news, I would say, to counter to Miguel's sobering reality about funding structures, is that young people are really, really excited and hungry for some kind of possibility for their lives. Those of us who sit on college campuses, we receive young people every year. They come to us, many of them, with a lot of hope, with a lot of commitments and aspirations for things they want to do and be in their lives. That's a huge source of power for us. Building relationships with those students. And of course, the big source of power when we talk about research are the folks who are on the front lines, doing the work in communities of not just battling against things like industrial agribusiness, but as we hear from Carmen's stories, they're on the front lines of creative work, of building new things that show us what's possible, that open our imaginations, that help to counter the pessimism that enters into our blood when we do look at the realities that Miguel has talked about. So I think the avenue is organizing. I think sources of power include, most importantly, relationships that we must build together. And I think the research that is most exciting is the research that will come from those relationships and that work that will help open the imagination. This is the spirit of Imagining America that I am so happy to be connected to. How do we help people imagine new futures, new possibilities, new systems and structures? I think there's a lot of ripeness across the whole planet right now for that. If we're not destroyed by our sense of pessimism and hopelessness, we must hear what Miguel is saying. We must not shy away from difficult truths of funding structures and systems and things like that. But we must also open ourselves up to our own creative imaginations, and that will come when we do the work of organizing.
If I could refer to the book, in the struggle, the title is a directive statement for researchers on where they should be located. It's also a declarative or directive statement to institutions and to administrators, to foundations of where the problem solving is most effective. Miguel, we just spoke with folks at Michigan State the other day They basically said the exact same thing you did, that R1 universities can't be trusted, that they're just, you won't survive in them if you want to do the kind of work that's described in the book. And so when I tell people about the book, I first of all say you don't need to read the chapters in order. And if it's a young organizer from a farm worker background, immigrant background in Central Valley, I say you start with Ernesto Galarza. And Galarza has some wonderful pieces in the book where he's talking to Chicano study students in the 1970s at Berkeley, giving them advice on how to survive. Basically, take everything you can from the institution and apply it to your community that you come from, and return to the community that you come from. We have Don Villarejo telling us in the chapter title of his in the book, take a bath among the people. You have Isao Fujimoto unleashing wild-eyed idealistic students in the 1960s and 70s into the Mississippi Delta, into the Central Valley, into Appalachia, having them come back and articulate the methods that they used to even survive. Some of the chapters they wrote about was how to survive in a car. Why aren't universities unleashing this potential? And we can't get caught up on thinking it's all about money. Bard McAllister, a Quaker in the Valley, once said, if money's your only problem, you don't have any problems. We have to start the fight and get in the game. The institutions will help us tremendously. I'm so happy that Gleesman and Miguel are there, that Scott is there. But for many of the young folks, go to the university, take it as a sabbatic from life, and come back and do organizing. That's the fight is going to be on the ground in our communities, and it's long-term, it's relational, it's trust building. If you can commit your whole life to it, that will result in change. Not a master's thesis or a very short-term deal. You should do that too. But if you really want to have an impact, start getting ready to commit your life to these values that you feel inside of your heart.
Thank you, Dan. I know we have some questions from participants. So I just want to, this is such, as Scott said, we need to sit together over a long meal over several hours and continue this conversation. And I think I will take the plug from Scott and say that this is what Carmen is sharing as the example is the work of creating new alternatives is actually necessary for our survival, right? The survival of our minds, of our hearts, of our sense that something's possible. And that's true for many people in academic institutions. Don't think he's out and do half of his work at his house or at farmer's market, right? So I think we kind of pretend that we're in a gate that is closed, right? And you can't go out into the world and back and forth and do all sorts of amazing, good, beautiful work. I saw Carmen with a please one more comment before we turn to questions. So Carmen, yes, and then Mina is giving me the questions, so I promise I will ask them after Carmen.
Thanks, Erica. I was just also going to mention that I think in terms of the academic world and the educational institutions that are very structured around career goals and whatnot. And I think for my reality going through graduate studies, I realized that I was not an academic. The academic world tends to make you want to believe that you're separate from your own community and that all of the knowledges that are constructed in the university are the ones that are upheld. And we obviously, many of us here know even the roots of the academic institutions. And so even just going through my graduate studies, I realized that I was actually, my community, I was part of a community that was just, that can theorize, that can create scholarship even outside of these gates, that we can create research and we can find these different avenues of knowledge production that have to do sometimes very little with the forms of the institution.
Thank you, Carmen. The first question that we have, and yes, absolutely. Actually, the fact that the most important knowledge is produced by those closest to the problems. So first question, and I'm trying to keep on task here to get at least a couple in, is Christy asks the recent barriers against the UFW and farm work. Oh no, wait, sorry, that's a, sorry, I'm seeing multiple questions here. There was one about the comparison between pesticide protections in Europe and the United States. I don't know if any of you, perhaps Miguel, someone who has an international lens, wants to comment on the differential pesticide policies and efforts in the US compared to the United States. Someone asked, how can we learn from the European success?
Well, Europe has a lot of, the European Union has imposed a lot of environmental schemes, but it's all going to what is they call integrated agriculture. So actually, it's a combination of organic and conventional, and pesticide use has gone up in Europe and not down. So I don't know what there's too much to learn. And again, we come to the point that we want to transform agriculture within the framework of a capitalist society or a capitalist economy, and I wonder how transformative you can be as opposed to reformist. And I think that the Europeans have been reformist in their approach to pesticide reduction, to promoting agriculture, and so on and so on. They are very much into organic agriculture, but organic agriculture, for example, in Latin America, doesn't do anything for food sovereignty because it's all for export, and the food is more expensive, so it's not accessible to the poor people, and so on and so on. So I maybe I'm missing some points about, there are probably a lot of things that we can learn from Europe, but I think that the main point is that the change has to come from the reality, the socio-economic, cultural reality that you have here in California, that is also very different from Latin America.
Thank you, Miguel. Another question, perhaps for Daniel, Carmen, or Janaki, from Lee, to address the educational system in rural communities. Lee asks, please address quality of education and low achievement scores in rural communities and what we can do about it. I don't know.
I want to push back just on the framing of the question a little bit. You don't need formal education to understand your world. And so, first of all, who are the knowledge producers and the knowers? We have a racist term in English, farm worker. We know what that means. And yet we know NAFTA pushed many farmers off their land, and many of them indigenous folks that have longer histories of farming than the 5-generation old white farmer here. And those farm workers now dispossessed, now being taxed without representation. We have a voting rights issue of huge proportions there, and a little oppression going on. And those folks, and say the Hmong immigrants here who are fantastic farmers, we have so many intercultured and multi-ethnic ways of knowing how to farm. And in an era of climate change, knowing how to farm will be the most important knowledge we will have. And so, I just want to contest what knowledge is and who we should be listening to and learning from. And we go back to Carmen and how she is democratizing the assemblies, empowering literal farmers who are positioned and subjugated as farm workers at this moment in time. We have to invert that. The book, Taylor and others say the folks that have the workers of the land need to be owners of it. It goes back to Zapata as well. This is a sheer moment of democracy where we need a cooperative owning of our economic system.
I will, I really have resisted until this moment, but my own research and book is a study in co-optation, and in the archives you can find that Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez and the early farm worker movement organizers in the early 60s were actually attempting to build farm worker cooperatives and mutual aid organizations. That was the original goal of the movement, but entanglements with nonprofit institutionalization, relationships with funders, and of course joining the strikes with Larry Itliong led to a union movement and a nonprofit sector approach, and mutual aid approaches and land ownership of campesino owned farms and farm worker collectives was kind of an original goal. So in a way, we're there again, right? And that question of land and land collectives and land ownership is still with us as pressing and central.
I just wanted to add that in Latin America, we're very inspired by the teachings of Paulo Freire, who wrote the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. which is a totally different pedagogy. And actually, La Vía Campesina has created the IALAs, which are the Institutos Agroecológicos Latinoamericanos. These are agroecological schools, because they didn't find the responses in the universities, in the formal educational system, for the education of the young peasant people, women and men. And they have created their own schools and their own using pedagogies that are totally appropriate and different from what we do in the Western universities.
Thank you, Miguel. So we have one more question. We have a lot of questions from Christy. So Christy, I wish that we had a platform where we could just invite you to ask the questions yourself. But this last question, then I'm going to turn to our closing call to action. Christy's asking that we comment on the new rules against UFW and farm workers to be able to vote off-site from where the union representatives are, that further disenfranchises these essential workers. How can we as communities support voting rights? I'm not sure if the question is voting rights as in elections or union voting rights, but do any of you have a response to either of those questions? Janaki.
Yeah, well, I will just use whatever time to just be in utter dismay about the veto of that law, and the fact that for those who maybe don't keep up with these kinds of things, this is in reference to a bill that was before the assembly that would make it possible for farm workers to vote in union elections from home, which is the way that all of us have been able to vote in elections, state elections and federal elections during the pandemic. And of course, farm workers come to work and are placed under tremendous pressures and coercion. And already as it is, it's incredibly difficult for organizers to access farm workers. I myself have had to, as a worker at California Rural Legal Assistance, which often is kind of the only organization that's out there in the rural areas, going on to farm worker housing. I shouldn't say that, but on the outside of farm worker housing, yelling, getting people to come out to the public street and having conversations. Is incredibly difficult for organizers to access. And this rule came on the heels of the Cedar Point Nursery case, which was overturning the ability for union organizers to actually go onto farmland in order to access workers. So, I mean, I'm seeing a note in here that says I'm a poll worker and union representatives are not allowed anywhere near the voters. This is a tremendously difficult issue, of course, knowing that there's so many undocumented farm workers. And what we need to do as civil society is be supporting these organizations on the ground who have these histories of close relationship with farm workers, to be able to create safe spaces, ensure that what voting rights laws we have in place, civil rights laws, are enforced, even when nobody's looking, because oftentimes it's on these agricultural lands where some of the greatest atrocities take place. So support California Rural Legal Assistance and your poll workers.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And some of these players who've been out there advocating for access and monitoring, like CRLA, have been in the fields for years and years and decades. So absolutely. Thank you, Janaki. I'm going to close with the final question that I'm going to have a one-sentence cap on. And that's a closing go around the circle with each of your own call to action. Going forward, what do you want our guests and participants and colleagues in the field to know from your own perspective on what is most pressing in this moment, if you were to bring forth a call to action? And feel free to name your own organization or resources you would like people to look at beyond this conversation. And I'll go around my circle, which starts with Scott, and please try to keep it to one sentence as we have 1 minute left.
I just think our energies need to not be destroyed by the depths of despair and darkness that the times we're living in can lead us to. Instead, we need to keep our eyes on what Carmen and her folks are showing us, because that's the avenue of inspiration.
Thank you, Scott. Carmen.
it would be more of just keep organizing wherever we're at. We need to do that across from multiple sectors, multiple spaces, from many communities, and keep finding ourselves in the pathway towards that place where we all need to go, because we're that despair that we talk about is truly there, and there's possibilities of imagining different worlds together.
Thank you, Carmen. Miguel.
Well, agroecology creates spaces of hope. So all the successful peasant farms that we have in Latin America that are doing agroecology constitute what we call lighthouses that inspire others. So it's a very hopeful approach. It's the only approach, the only viable approach for the future. And the last thing is that we cannot put all the weight of the change of agricultural systems and food systems on the producers and farmers, but consumers, have a huge responsibility, because eating is an ecological and political act. And when you support the small farmers, then you're creating socio-ecological resiliency and sustainability in your community.
Thank you, Miguel. Janaki.
I'll say a really immediate one, which is to support California Institute for Rural Studies, the organization founded by Don Villarejo, who are completing a COVID-19 farm worker study, which is gathering really important information right now for enforcement.
Thank you, Janaki. Daniel.
The preface of the book ends with this: contests over truth are wars of attrition. What's happened in our country, this country founded upon native genocide, slavery, the takings of lands, it's not done. We're still fighting. We're still standing. And there's no option to give up. So it's now, I'm very optimistic about what's happening in California, in the Central Valley and the Pajaro Valley. Help us. If we can turn these two endemically structured, racially oppressive structures are operating here, but they are weaker than we think. Let's topple them, and it might set a model for toppling them in other places of across the globe. But let's focus now on transforming these two endemically structured neo-feudal places. We cannot tolerate this kind of system. It will pollute everything else. And so let's change California and its valleys right now. Agroecology is the frame to do so. I'm very optimistic. All the folks on this call give me so much heart and hope. I just am so grateful to join with you today.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you, everyone. What an honor to join you in this conversation. It is clearly to be continued in all of your scholarship and action and organizing and work and farms and gardens. I'm so inspired, and personally, it's a pleasure to be with what I call Gramscian spirits. We all seem to have a pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. So it really was a joy to be with you here today. Before signing off, you will all get a 25% discount on the book In the Struggle by going to the New Village Press website and using the code STRUGGLE25. So please do get the book. It is a beautiful read, and believe me, it does actually have humor and optimism in it as well. So thank you all so much again. I really appreciate it. I thank you from the Imagining America staff and community with my heart. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.